Hello, I'm Tino Cuéllar, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. At the Carnegie Endowment, we've been around for more than a century as a source of trusted analysis, research about where the world is and where it's going, and a source of support for sensible diplomacy in an unruly planet that is filled with risks and opportunities. Even back in our early days, my predecessors understood that changing technologies would both advance and complicate our mission. In our early days, scientists were mapping genes to chromosomes. They were theorizing general relativity in the background as we did our work. These and other discoveries ultimately helped catalyze a century of enormous economic growth and development. In fact, development never seen in the history of our species. Science and technology eventually brought extreme poverty rates down from more than 56% at mid century to 9% today. But they also explain why the Carnegie Endowment in the 50s and 60s and 70s came to focus on nuclear weapons as a major source of global risk, and why we are focused to this day on cutting edge technologies that bring potential risks as well as opportunities, and why we are so concerned about climate change. Today, we're dealing with big changes in both technology and geopolitics, from bioinformatics to large language models with billions of parameters, breakthroughs in understanding protein folding. Modern mobile phones today contain more than a million times more memory and processors and about 3,000 times more powerful computing power than the guidance computers in the Apollo 11 module. In fact, the chargers for our devices contain chips more powerful than those used on Apollo 11. Sequencing a human genome today costs roughly 0.0014% of what it cost in 2001, takes hours instead of years. To map how these technologies of tomorrow will affect the United States, the US's position, and the entire world, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Eric Schmidt. Now, I could say many things about how I've benefited from Eric's insights in a variety of settings, particularly through a board we serve on, but we thought it might be fitting to let one of the recent large language models, in this case, ChatGPT, pull something together. So here's what it generated. And here I quote: as the world continues to grapple with the impacts of these emerging technologies, it is more important than ever to bring together experts and thought leaders to discuss and address these complex issues. It is with this in mind that we're pleased to welcome Dr. Eric Schmidt, a leading technology executive and innovative thinker. As former CEO of Google, Dr. Schmidt played a pivotal role in the growth and development of the company, helping to shape the modern tech landscape as we know it today. In addition to his work at Google, Dr. Schmidt is also the co-founder of Schmidt Futures, an organization that works to advance the use of technology for the public good, and the founder of the Special Competitive Studies Project, a research project focused on the intersection of technology, business, and policy. We're honored to have him with us today to share his insights and experiences on these important topics. Not quite Shakespeare, and doesn't do justice to the work Eric's done with Henry Kissinger and others on the looming global impact of AI, but I give it a solid A minus for writing that took about 5 seconds. Welcome, Eric. We have much to discuss, and before we break, we'll take a few questions from the audience, but I just want to say I'm delighted to see you again.
Well, first place, thank you. This is the first introduction that I've had by ChatGPT. And I just cannot imagine how much prompt engineering you needed to get such a beautiful intro.
The amount of prompt engineering will remain classified for now, but maybe I'll share it at the end.
We can discuss that. We can discuss this with light. I have been such a supporter of the Carnegie Endowment over years. And now with you in charge, we're working very closely with you on both national security and technology matters, and we will continue to do so for a very long time. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure. So let's start with phases of technology development and how the world looks now relative to when you were maybe in the middle of your tenure as CEO of Google. So the world's changed quite a bit since then relative to, say, the mid-2000s. Back then, we had about 450 million internet users. Today, we have about 5.5 billion. We have this massive progress on the AI front with these multi-billion parameter AI large language models. We have quantum science is advancing. We had a session on that here at Carnegie earlier today with Ben Lev from Stanford. And I want to get your sense on how the balance of risk and opportunity to look to you then and how it looks now. Where do you see the risks being different relative to what they were back then? And where do you see the opportunities being different?
Well, it's interesting that you used the statistics about the Apollo mission as part of your introduction. I calculated that the computer that I use, Android or iPhone, for example, is 100 million times more capable than the computers that I used when I was in college. And how do you get to 100 million? The answer is Moore's law. And what you're seeing is the natural extrapolation of the power when computational power, digital power doubles every couple of years or so. And due to the extraordinary cleverness of an awful lot of physicists and scientists, we are continuing at a pace somewhat off of that, but close to it. So, for example, today we have these huge issues around China and the United States around access to sub 10 nanometer chip designs. And the leader is a company that's a unique monopoly at the moment in the Netherlands called ASML. And the Trump and Biden administrations figured out that controlling that one source had huge downside impact in terms of the evolution of the digital world, advantaging the West against China. And China, of course, is fighting back. Now, that all makes perfect sense, but let me tell you the facts. The facts are that they're dealing with things the width of an atom. That's how complicated these chips are. Literally 1 nanometer is roughly the width of an atom, and they can't get much faster, and they're at 3 or 4 nanometers right now. The level of precision that has been achieved by humanity in the engineering of the systems is extraordinary. So when I go back 20 years ago, I used to give this speech back when we were all optimists, okay? All of us were techno-optimists, and 20 years ago we said, oh, it's gonna be great, everyone's gonna get connected and so forth. And what even I, who can do math, couldn't understand what happens when you have scale computing at this level. So the quantum results that you're describing, quantum is impossibly hard to understand, is at such a level of resolution that we're beginning to be able to understand how quantum works in a mathematical way and in a digital simulation way. This is extraordinary. These changes, no one understands how fast this is. You used ChatGPT to introduce me. ChatGPT is based on GPT 3.5, which is 1 year old. OpenAI has said that there's a new version of GPT coming out early this year, I guess in a month or two, which is infinitely more capable than the one that you used. God knows what it will know. In fact, the most interesting thing about these models that people have now achieved, which is a huge breakthrough, is that you train them from the world's knowledge, and then you try to discover what they know. And they seem to know things that humans don't know. And everyone is gaga over this.
Right. You know, I think about how Derek Parfit, the philosopher, was once described as a machine to convert coffee into philosophical insights. And this picks up, of course, on both the analogies and disanalogies between brain science and how these models develop. And it highlights a sort of question about how difficult it is, Eric, to extrapolate from the current state of technology what will happen next. Some of it, like in the case of Moore's Law, we develop a set of insights that will carry us forward to some degree. But in particular, these large generative models, do you see them as representing a real phase change in AI development with really big implications for geopolitics and policy? Or do you think in 7 to 10 years, we're just going to be at a very different point where what's exciting about AI is, you know, some generative algorithm that is 1,000 lines long that we've just figured out that's just so different from what we have imagined now that it'll take us in a different direction?
Well, we have been so concerned about this that Dr. Kissinger and I and Dan Huttenlocher, and you interviewed Dr. Kissinger on stage on this matter, wrote a book on this. And Dr. Kissinger says that if you look at history, and of course he's the world's best historian these days, if you look at history, the Enlightenment was a real change in thinking, a change in the way we perceived ourselves. We moved from the age of religion or belief, in other words, God told you, to the age of reason. He believes, and I agree with him, that we're about to go through a similar epochal change in the way we operate. And let me explain why. From birth, each and every one of us is organized around our senses, what we see and what we hear. And we are trained to believe what we see and hear. It's how we are safe, it's how we live, it's how we operate as human beings. In a world where computing systems are generating everything around you, what can you believe? What does it mean to be human when the primary source of your visual inputs, the things you see, the things you hear, and the things you respond to are not generated by facts and circumstance and humans, but rather by computers that are optimizing for an outcome. Now, there are many, many benefits of a generative system, right? We can generate specific solutions. We can generate art. We can generate education. The generative systems also allow us to generate, for various technical reasons, new drugs, new science, new biology, and so forth. But what happens when the same technologies are applied to the visual world that you live in, the news? My favorite example is that you're a well-known individual. You have a distinguished legal career. You've been a judge, a Supreme Court judge. You're a really big deal. So now someone without your permission takes your likeness, your voice, your appearance, and turns you into somebody that you're not. A racist, a sexist, a prejudiced person, an idiot. What rights do you have over that image? How can you secure your reputation, which is central to the way you operate, the impact that you have, your believability, right? And you're not even a politician, right? Imagine what will happen to political leaders who will be subject to this constant manipulation of what they said. The moment for me was a month ago when a podcast and Podcast AI was released, which is an interview between Joe Rogan and Steve Jobs, who's been dead for a decade. And Steve Jobs was a very close friend of mine. And when I heard Steve's voice synthesized by a computer, as though he was alive today, talking in his style with his insights about a fact, I almost started crying. It was such a shock to my existence, to my system. I believe each and every one of the people watching this will have such a shock, and it'll be personal and it'll be jarring.
Two points about that come to mind, Eric. It's a very compelling example. One is you're incredibly well versed in all the technology necessary to make that conversation happen, and you still had a visceral emotional response. Right? Highlights
shook.
Right. There's sort of parts of our own brains that will be activated by these technologies that will defy our logic in a sense. And then the other point is completely agree with you about how risky and complicated it is to manage a set of stimuli that we will now be able to generate on command that will perform as if they were real people in effect. And if hypothetically, and this is hypothetical, we manage to get exactly the right rules about all this domestically, perfectly enforced in the United States, think about the challenge of then coming up with a framework that applies in the European Union, in China, in Myanmar, in India, in Nigeria. So I'm thinking about everything you're saying, and then I'm trying to take it to the next level in terms of the
Let me give you an example of the first time I saw this. This was 10 years ago. A bunch of crazy people built a video which was derogatory of Muslims. It was called the Innocence of Muslims. It was shot in traditional mechanisms. It was not using AI. And it was released, and it caused riots in a number of Muslim countries, including Pakistan, where people died. And it was on YouTube. And this was an emergency when I was CEO of Google. And we ultimately restricted it. And I said, well, are the people watching the video? And they said, no. What's happening is the TV stations are watching the video, and the TV stations are reporting to the people that this video exists. People were dying who had not even seen the video and were dying for a cause that had been promoted to them by, in my view, these horrific television stations. The issue here is that I and you can, at some level of training, we can basically deal with this. But what happens when you have a malicious actor, right? Now, the techno-optimist of me 15 years ago would have said, well, there won't be malicious actors. Well, I was obviously wrong. There are people who will use this for terrible outcomes. They'll lie and cheat and steal, and they'll use the existence of this false information to cause harm. We don't have a solution in society for this. We really don't. And the worst places will be the ones that are least governed, the failed states, the states that are poorly managed, not the democracies, and not even an autocracy like China, which will control it. It's the ones that are that are neither democracies nor well-run autocracies.
No, I hear you. And I gather that implicit in that, Eric, and you can fill in the details here, is an idea that some of the technologies that are resource intensive to develop right now, like the large language models, or the equivalent for graphics, will be decentralized, deployable, and scaled down enough that they would be accessible by governments that don't have resources and by non-state actors, presumably. Is that the thought?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I was trying to think about for our audience today, what are the three short-term dangers of all of this? Now, one is actually much simpler than the one we're discussing, which is easy for all of us to understand. It's the creation of killer viruses. Viruses turn out to be relatively simple to construct. So an AI system using generative design techniques that I'm describing, plus a database of how biology actually works, and a machine that makes the viruses, which do exist, you can actually get them built using essentially sequencers, could start building terrible viruses. How are we going to solve that problem? I've just been named to a national commission to discuss this. What laws, what restrictions? Okay, let's say that the US gets this right. Let's say the Western system gets this right. Let's say China gets this right. Well, what about a rogue state? How do they solve that? The second issue is the one we're discussing now, which is the ability to use these techniques to target harm, target misinformation that is really bad. It's not acceptable, right? It leads to violence, it leads to prejudice, it leads to bad outcomes. Now, why would you do that? Well, maybe you're a psychopath. We have plenty of those in our history and certainly some alive today. But you could also be an immoral business who's trying to sell a product that's bad and you're lying about it, right? There's plenty of examples of that, right? And so those are two examples of this issue. And then the third one has to do with conflict. And the way conflict can be understood is, imagine a cyber war where the systems make their decisions faster than human decision time, right? So again, you're a senior person, you understand national security really well. By the way, Carnegie is working with us on some of these matters, so thank you for this help. What happens when the decision cycle is faster than humans can decide? And remember that the systems that I'm describing have the interesting property that they make mistakes. You don't want these systems flying the airplane. You want it advising the pilots, that's fine. You don't want them in something involving life-critical things because they make mistakes. My favorite example, this is a ChatGPT example, is I said to it, ChatGPT, write me an essay of why all skyscrapers more than 300 meters tall should be made of butter. And it wrote a beautiful essay of why butter was renewable, it was strong, it was tasty, and so forth and so on. I did the same query 2 days later, and it changed its mind, and it said, that's a terrible idea, it's not strong enough. But what I don't know is, I don't know how ChatGPT learned the fact. And one of the problems with large language models today is that the technical term is they hallucinate. You can actually give it a series of questions which will cause it to believe that up is down and gravity doesn't exist and left becomes right, and things which are nonsensical to any human being, that are for every human being would say, well, that's the stupidest thing ever. We don't fully understand the nature of how these large language models work, and we know they make mistakes.
It's a terrific point, Eric. And I mean, to pick up the connection you're making between those large language models, that hallucination, and the decision-making point, I suspect that one of the big challenges that people like you and I will have in the next, say, 3 to 5 years, as we try to grapple with the questions around AI and technology particularly, will be how these systems infiltrate decision-making, right, and when that decision-making infiltration, as it were, is a positive thing for society. Like when, say, relative to the kind of diagnostics you might get from a human doctor, if you're trying to provide medical care to a very large population that doesn't normally have access to a doctor, you're making a net improvement. And when you're building in something that is coherent, that sounds logical, that sounds fluent in the decision, and is just likely to be wrong in sometimes in unpredictable ways.
So it's interesting you mentioned medicine. There are 2 or 3 projects now which have recently, using these large language models, achieved roughly the same level of accuracy of diagnosis of the average doctor, which is not an expert. Right? In other words, the sort of the average knowledge that doctors have, they've achieved. So let's say you have an average doctor and you have one of these medical systems. And the average doctor makes certain kind of mistakes, and the medical system makes analogous mistakes. What's our tolerance for that? Is it good enough to replace the human doctor by the average AI doctor who makes mistakes, or is the standard higher? Most people believe that the standard for the AI system should be higher. But if you follow that line of reasoning, then you'll never have a self-driving car, because the AI-based self-driving cars will make mistakes too, but one error will be national news. Whereas there's about 90 to 100 people dying on the streets of the United States every day in cars, roughly 35,000 deaths or so a year. So we have to really think about this question of where, you said it so well, where is the line of implementation? Today, my answer on the record is use these systems in an advisory way, but have the human make the decision. Because that we have a legal concept for. Again, you can speak to the question of liability, the liability of the system. You know, my favorite joke is, I'm driving in California, and I do one of those California rolling stops. Maybe you do this too, since you live in California.
I'm not going to admit to that, but
you can admit to that. You're not going to confess. And so the police comes over, and the policeman says, "You did a rolling stop," and I say, "I wasn't." And he said, "Well, who did?" And he said, "The car says, 'I did, officer.'" And the officer says, "Why?" And the car says, "I don't know." Who does the policeman put the ticket on? Question. So that simple example, another example is art. If you take somebody's as input, constructivist art, some beautiful piece of art, and then you modify it into something different, who owns the copyright? Who gets the money?
And I would add to that, maybe to just pick up on that very point, we don't have perfect answers for that in the human context, but we do have, depending on exactly how you count, somewhere between 500 years and 100,000 years of experience in dealing with disputes between humans, disagreements between humans, as we scale up from like tribes to villages, to city-states, to small countries, to large countries, to supranational entities. What we don't have, and this is key, I think, even for somebody like you, who is not a techno-optimist anymore, perhaps, but sees the possibilities for enhancing human welfare with this technology, is to realize that the technologies can sound less alien than they actually are, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can actually put on a slide or ask ChatGPT a question in a way that you kind of get an intuitive feel for how this works. But when you're talking hundreds of billions of parameters, I think part of the takeaway to your point about advisory is we're trying to build up fast a degree of experience and tissue with how we intersect with machines when we're trying to make the biggest and most important decisions in the world.
But let me push on this just slightly harder. I happen to know that you are a human being, and I happen to know that you think. I know that you were born. I know that you have a family. I know that you have to sleep. I know you have to eat, all that kind of stuff. We have shared humanity. You know the same about me. So now I'm dealing with an AI system. It has no shared humanity with me. It doesn't sleep. It doesn't have to eat. I guess it has to have electricity to keep running, right? I don't know what its worries about in the sense of anxiety. I don't know its failure modes. I don't know how manipulable it is. I don't know. Let's imagine you're dealing with the worst possible human being in the world, Hitler or somebody like that. You still know that they're human. They're just a horrifically bad one. We don't know the boundary in these AI systems for where's the boundary line, right?
Exactly. So picking up a little bit on both the risks and the possibilities, let's talk a bit more about the developing world. You've mentioned driving, you've mentioned medicine as domains where you can definitely see the AI side of things, maybe even on the medicine side, the biomedicine side, as being quite fertile in terms of potential to improve human welfare. We're dealing with people who are, to a first approximation, not as extremely poor as they were a generation ago, but very aware, maybe more aware than ever in history, of the inequalities that they face. So if you're looking at a young kid growing up in Jakarta or in a big, big city in Africa, or in a rural area of India, just uncertain about their economic future, not likely to be part of the global economy, more likely to be part of the local economy, but they have a smartphone, right? How how do you think about the future of that child and what these technologies can offer that child that can make that individual feel like she has something invested in this technological future?
So let's put it in a positive and negative context. The single most important thing we should do as a world civilization is more development of the capabilities of our humans, more training, more opportunity, more of everything. The strength of humanity is our knowledge, our wisdom, our ability to reason, our ability to communicate, our ability to work on all of these things. People get confused. They think somehow we should build more roads. No, we should build more schools first. You can add the roads later, right? And schools here are metaphorical. And these AI systems have the promise of providing individual level education of a world-class nature to every human on the planet, including the bottom billion. And I think you know the math that essentially the middle class in the world has gone from abject poverty to what we would think of as lower middle class. Roughly 2 billion people have been elevated in the last 20 years. It's an extraordinary achievement, right? And by the way, we're hearing from them now. They want more. They want refrigeration. They want safety and educate. They want the same things we do. And even the bottom, even the poorest dollar of a day person is benefiting from this. So the good news is, with this ability to do online direct education, we can reach them in their language and take them from zero to a PhD. And we can do it in the way that they learn. That's the promise, right? Here's the problem. When we do that, we also put them online in all sorts of ways that are not culturally appropriate, not developmentally approachable, easily manipulated. And my favorite example is actually pretty simple. Again, you're a proper justice. You understand the long history of the law with respect to minors, and in most cases, minors below the age of 18 or 16 are protected from the sort of responsibilities and penalties for being an adult. And yet today, you get a 10-year-old girl who gets a phone, who has access to every single aspect, good and bad, of the adult world. You get a 10-year-old boy, the same thing. We're doing this massive experiment on the development of teenage girls and boys. I'm more concerned about the girls than the boys for all sorts of evidentiary reasons, but let's assume we're worried about both. And yet there's no limit on that. There's no constraint on it. The current law says that it's called COPA, is that you have to protect people below 13. But the rest of society is age 16 or 18. So we are launching this technology onto people who are probably not, at least from an age perspective, relative to deal with adult material. God knows why we did this. I have no idea what will happen. Now, my favorite example here is a decade ago, I was in Myanmar, Burma, and there was a war or a fight in a town near where I was between the Rohingya and the Buddhists. I knew nothing about the country at the time. And I figured the internet had just arrived and these people would talk to each other, they would get to know each other. And instead, they used the internet to essentially falsely accuse the other of violence and kill more people, which is precisely not what we did the internet for. We were that naive.
I think in some ways a theme of our conversation, and I appreciate the candor, is that technology is about unintended consequences, and that can have a generative impact on human well-being, but also real damage. And I wonder, because you have the distinctive experience of having been right in the middle of this, Eric, for so long on the private sector side, which of course is, now you do a range of things, private and more public sector. But at the time, how do you think about those years? And, with the wisdom you have now, if you could go back in time, were there things you might do differently from the time you were CEO?
Well, there are many things I would do differently, but I think that the simplest explanation is that we didn't take all those sociology classes that you did. We didn't take all those liberal arts classes. We didn't take all those history classes. We were ignorant. Again, my friend Henry Kissinger, yours as well, I would give him this speech and he would say, well, that's not what history says. History says that these are cycles, that this happens over and over again and so forth. And he said it in a nice way, but what he meant was, you idiot, right? You know, he didn't say that, but how could you be so naive, Eric, to not understand the lessons of history and how humanity works? So we collectively believe very, very strongly now that these tools are much more powerful than the technologists believe. And the technologists are building them without an understanding of what they will do to people not like them. In my defense, remember, I live in a world of confirmatory bias. So virtually all the people that I work with, all my friends and so forth, have similar levels of education, similar levels of cultural bias, similar political values, similar moral and religious values. And ours are not universal. In fact, we're a minority compared to the majority of the world. And so how could you, as a CEO today, right, operate on a global platform without having a historian and a globalist and a philosopher and someone who understands the sociology of the countries that you're operating in? And the companies aren't run that way. That's got to get fixed.
That feels profoundly important. And part of what I hear you saying is that there's a matter of meeting a market test where even then the liberal arts and the historian and the sociologist would help. But beyond the market test, there's an ethical piece. And if you're going to have a serious engagement with ethics and morality, which frankly, any board that I know of would want, right? You ought to have access to that kind of knowledge.
Exactly.
Speaking of cycles of history and Dr. Kissinger, so these days at Carnegie, there's not a day that goes by that conversations I have don't have something to do with the U.S. and China and the dynamic between them. So I know this is an issue you've thought about quite a bit, and I wonder how you think about the competitive dynamic between the U.S. and China on this domain, both in terms of the risks of a sort of arms race around the technological side of the military, but also more generally, like how we deal with regulatory and governance problems around technology when we have a new moment in history of great power tensions.
It should be possible for the West and the East, or China and the West, to come to some agreements in the same way that we've agreed for various forms of nuclear restrictions, because these things are just too dangerous. I think the simplest example would be launch on warning systems. If you go back to the Dr. Strangelove movie, you'll remember in the movie, there was a device, in this case in the Soviet Union, that was decided to launch independent of whether the threat actually arrived or not. It had to launch before the weapon got there. And it was automatic. It couldn't be stopped. And so the movie, in the case of Dr. Strangelove, ends with horrific tragedy because it becomes self-perpetuating. I'm very concerned about automatic weapon systems where the computers make the decisions as to offense and defense. And by the way, how could this occur? Well, partly because the wars can happen so quickly, right? It happens faster than human reason time. But even if you acknowledge it's slowing it down, having the computers with the kind of errors they make such consequential decisions are horrific. Look, in the case of Ukraine, we have one horrific person in the form of President Putin essentially initiating this sort of extraordinarily bad outcome for both his own country, as well as obviously the Ukrainians and the rest of the world with food shortages and so forth and so on. So I worry a lot about that. But I think overall, when I look at China is engaged in building platforms that are competitive with the West. It's really important that Western values imbue inside of those platforms. The simplest example has to do with surveillance. The internet is largely not a surveillance platform, and China is largely a surveillance platform. It's illegal, for example, in China to have an unauthenticated internet connection. Every connection is known to be located, so that way the police can come visit you. That would be a violation of a gazillion norms in the West. right? So the core issues of freedom and free speech and free political speech and freedom of movement are being violated in the Chinese model. Now, I can't fix their problem. That's their country. Those are their laws and so forth and so on. But I know that I don't want our platform to reflect their values. I want it to reflect ours. And so you have a contest now between AI. You have a contest in quantum. You have a contest in biology. You have a contest in essentially new energy. If I score it, we've lost largely in financial services. China is 1 or 2 generations ahead. We are currently losing in new energy. They're at least a couple generations ahead. We are slightly ahead in AI. I was the chairman of a commission that came to that conclusion, but it's close. In quantum, we're slightly ahead, but they're doing some things which are very important, which we can talk about. And in biology, we are somewhat ahead, and they have a big program to catch up. In semiconductors, we're now a couple generations ahead. China, for example, appears to be building 7 nanometer chips. 7 lower is better. And the state of the art in Taiwan is around 4 nanometers. So you would say that's 1 to 2 generations. A generation is a couple of years. It's not very far behind us.
No.
And so their model, which I'm not endorsing, has its strengths and weaknesses. Ours has strengths and weaknesses. We need to stay ahead. That's why something, for example, USICA, the CHIPS Act, was so important. In the West, we've got to spend the money and get people organized to stay ahead on these global platforms. I'm not as worried about the traditional debates over Taiwan and military incursion and so forth, because China's got its own problems, which we're all aware of, zero COVID and so forth. But I am very worried that the platforms that we build our open Western system on remain open and relative to our freedom values in our world. It's crucial. We don't want to give that up.
So a question from the audience that picks up on some of these themes is, leave aside for a moment the complexities between the US and China relationship and just focus on what, if anything, you think would be a responsible regulatory regime for AI development. Is there anything you can imagine that you would consider sensible and worth trying to pursue? So I'm not talking about some ham-fisted rule that tries to limit the number of parameters in a model, but anything around research ethics or the use of certain AI systems out in the marketplace when they might not be ready, or something that picks up on these national security concerns.
So the Europe, which is typically ahead in regulation and not ahead in anything else, came up with a set of AI regulations which said that you couldn't deploy an AI system unless it could explain itself in critical systems. Well, no AI system can explain itself together, so that's an example of bad regulation. Britain proposed, but ultimately canceled, a list of words that were harmful but legal that could not be used in AI systems. So you're seeing governments play with these, but we don't really have a good answer to your question. First, I think this is an area of a great deal of discussion and research, but what I'm worried about is I don't want to hold back the benefits of AI in terms of innovation, because the regulation tends to slow it down. But my primary concern is around this automatic question. I want humans to be responsible. So whenever there's generative design, whenever there's something going on, I want there to be a human who can be held responsible using our normal legal systems for the outcome. In the case of China, there are obviously a set of things that we could agree to. A no surprise rule. We have this, for example, with launches. We don't surprise each other by launching rockets randomly at each other. We actually give warning. There are all sorts of rules around nuclear for the same reason. I think it's really important with China that we begin that conversation. There's effectively no government and no two-track conversations around that, and that's a mistake.
We should keep talking about this. I'm going to pick up on another question that gets a little bit at time horizons, and that is, I think quite a bit about time here in this position, because some of what we do at Carnegie is about the here and now, is about track 2 diplomacy or a research report or analysis that is relevant to a decision that is a week away. But some of what we do here, I expect, will not pay off for 15 or 20 years. And in similar fashion, a member of the audience asks, as we continue to invest in AI, biotech, quantum, and other technologies that might have a payoff in the longer term, how to make sure the economy continues to deliver opportunities for the middle class, for people around the country that might not yet be anywhere near being able to benefit from those scientific advances?
I think that's a misreading of how science works, because I think that the diffusion of these scientific discoveries can be accelerated, but it fundamentally does, in most cases, apply to everyone. The improvements in biotech biology will help everyone with healthcare. These AI systems, when they're properly packaged, will help everyone with education, everyone with medical care, everyone with knowledge. So remain, I guess, the techno optimist that Google, which is effectively free to anyone in the world if they have an internet connection, makes you smarter, right? And I'm very proud to have had a small role in making that happen. The internet itself gives you this access. It makes your life more rich, more interesting, more entertainment, and so forth. I think those are good. So when you look at it from the standpoint of a middle class person, which is as you phrased the question, I think the most important thing is to look at where the costs are not coming down, which, by the way, is largely housing, which is not what we're discussing, and taxes and other things like that, and transfer payments. But the core arc of science is that it benefits everyone. There are plenty of examples where something scientific starts off as expensive, but if it's useful, its cost comes down very quickly. And we see that over and over again, and I expect that to continue.
So that brings us maybe to where we will have to end. And I want to maybe highlight that another theme that cuts across our entire conversation is responsibility. At several points, Eric, you've talked about what a responsible government would do, what a responsible legal system would do, what a responsible corporation would do, what we might expect from science and technology folks to engage with people who are in the social sciences and the humanities and so on. So I want to maybe return to that theme and ask you to highlight what most important things you would expect in the next, say, 3 to 5 years from government, from civil society, organizations like think tanks, philanthropy, et cetera, and from the private sector, if we are going to take all this progress that is possible, along with all the risk, and try to move it in a direction that will benefit humanity.
I would suggest a two-part answer. The first answer is organize for innovation. I don't mean to criticize the categories you just described, but most of them are not organized around innovation. They're organized around stability and regulation. So this stuff is coming. If it's done correctly, it's mostly positive. It does affect incumbencies, and usually for the better, right? It lowers costs, it creates more access, and those sorts of things. And I really do believe that. And what you see in government is organized around the incumbencies and the lobbying and the various forms of donations and so forth tend to perpetuate the status quo. This new stuff, when done properly, has enormous societal benefit in terms of connectivity, education, entertainment, knowledge, and making the human resource that is the most valuable thing we have. America is about the humans. We need more of them. They need to be better educated. They need to be more motivated and all the things that we can do. But I talk about the humans because the humans are what I'm focused on. So what is the regulatory approach? To look at the extreme cases. After nuclear stuff happened, you'll remember that there were rules about the proliferation of knowledge about nuclear. When I was in college, an undergraduate had managed to, in his undergraduate thesis, design the trigger mechanism for an atomic warhead, which indicated how smart he was, and he was immediately classified. Thank goodness. So we need to figure out where that line is. And I think one of the things that I haven't mentioned that's important is almost all of the software achievements have occurred because of open source. When you build a piece of software in our industry, it's typical that people just release the software for everyone. Guess what? The bad guys get it at the same time the good guys do. And so we in our industry have to have a real discussion with ourselves as to when we're going to release this stuff. Because you release it because you want to be famous, you want to think you're a big deal, you want to be, like, oh, look how cool I am. But imagine if I told you if you release that thing, then somebody who's a Uyghur will lose their lives because the Chinese will adopt it in some persecutorial way. How would you feel about your achievement? maybe you shouldn't be so liberal with respect to the distribution of this knowledge. We have not in our industry, and this is an area for work, figured out where that line is. My industry has taken the position that this stuff is just good. We'll just give it to everyone. More speech is good, more code is good, everyone is good. I don't think that's true anymore. It's too powerful.
I appreciate that throughout our conversation, you've shared candid reflections on what looks different to you now relative to 15, 20 years ago. But also, I mean, to go to your last point about innovation and done properly, that there's no one single silver bullet here. It's really an orientation and an approach that will require a lot from all of us, right? And I think just to highlight one of the points that you made, the promise of what is available in AI and the biosciences is enormous, but it will require an honesty about what the mistakes are that are possible and that have already been made to some extent. And we look forward to working with you and others to try to make sure humanity benefits as much as possible and can limit those risks.
And thank you to the Carnegie Endowment and obviously with your leadership. I mean, you guys are good, and we're going to continue to work on this together. It's such a rich set of problems, and if we get it right, the world is going to be so much better.
Thank you, Eric. To be continued.
Okay. Thank you again.
All the best. Bye-bye.